Well, it's lovely to welcome you back to St Andrews, and the title of today's talk is Miss Tampon Liberty, J. Critchley and Environmenstrual Art since 1970, and I'll pass over to Camilla now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And so, Laura, I'm just going to say kind of slide change here and there, and hopefully we'll be able to work together. Thank you so much for helping me out. So it's really nice to be here, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about a project I'm still very much at the starting point of, to do with this. Oh, one slide back, please. Yeah, thank you. To do with so-called environmenstrual movement. And in this presentation, I'm going to discuss a bit what that movement looked like and might look like today. But my starting point today is the work of the artist J. Critchley. And so I'm delighted to be here with all of you today, and would really welcome input in terms of other artists that you might have come across in your work who are interested in similar themes, or if you see any potential for other networks that might intersect in some ways with this one. So to introduce you to the topic, which really for this artist begins in the late 70s and 80s, when menstruation itself was not a topic frequently discussed in media, and certainly not in the art world. The US-based artist J. Critchley, who you can see here, made art out of discarded single-use plastic tampon applicators. So you can see this on the garment that he's wearing. And these were washed up and collected by Critchley on local beaches. He initially said that he had no idea what this was for, and his curiosity about these single-use plastic repetitive occurrences of finding waste on the beaches led him to be really curious. And it led him also on a decade-long quest to understand what he had found and why these items had washed up on the beaches in the area where he lived. So in this paper and larger project, I'm going to re-examine the background, creation and legacy of Critchley's artwork, which has not really been discussed much within art or environmental history. And if it has been discussed, some kind of quick statements to the fact that he was a menstrual activist, whereas I'm going to argue that there's slightly more going on here. It also positions the work of the artist in this larger environmenstrual movement that I mentioned, which I'm hoping to do more work on, and which was first examined by the scholar Chris Boble in her work about menstrual activism called New Blood, Third Wave Feminism and the Politics of Menstruation. So in that book, she points out that there was an activist movement interested in protesting against single-use plastic around the time and slightly before the occurrence of toxic shock syndrome as well. But Boble's book is situated in only parts of the North American continent, and does not take a wider artistic or international aspect. And the word environmenstrual itself that I'm going to be using a bit in this project, in this paper, was likely coined by the Women's Environmental Network in the late 20th century. So I'm kind of using this word retroactively, and it wasn't a word that Critchley, for example, would have known about at the time. So if you can have the second slide, please. So first of all, it's necessary to kind of situate where Critchley found these items, because it's quite a unique environment, and in some ways it reminds me a little bit of St Andrews, in that there are these massive sand dunes and sand ecosystems around a rather small and unique town. So Critchley began finding and collecting discarded applicators in the late 1970s. On the extreme end of Massachusetts, Cape Cod, where the town, now city of Provincetown, is located. This is a historic whaling and fishing port, and it's been known as a kind of safe haven for artists and LGBTQ plus communities throughout the 20th century, maybe even earlier. People were drawn to holiday in the beautiful landscape, to find each other, to party, and to make art. And this has been explored in detail in Karen Kroliuk's book, Provincetown from Pilgrim Landing to Gay Resort Heaven. And so artists like Helen Frankenthaler and Edward Hopper and Robert Motherwell would come here and be inspired by the landscape. And so there's been a real sense of preciousness about this landscape. It has to remain pristine because it's linked to this artistic heritage. And if it was to change a great deal, that would also be a threat to a great deal of creative energy. Now, Provincetown, as Karen's book alludes to in the title, is also where the Mayflower first set anchor, and where settler colonialists quickly squeezed out the Nauset tribe and renamed the settlements that already existed there. And if we can have the next slide, in a previous iteration of, or a draft version of this talk, I want to specifically thank Max Liberwan for pointing out a kind of initial failure of this paper not to reconcile with this paradox of Provincetown being a safe haven and a kind of pristine place of creativity and fun for some, and a place where other people were squeezed out really early. And so in his new book, the new book, Pollution is Colonialism, Liberwan writes that there is a long history of judging a society's waste management as a proxy for its level of civilization. And in the case of Provincetown and large parts of what later becomes these kind of United States cities, Liberwan writes about the sense that everything that came before was wasteland. And yet later it was the US systems which invented the waste we're also anxious about today and which we're discussing in Glasgow these last 2 weeks. And this is waste exactly like the items that Critchley found on the beach, like, for example, the very precise commercial item of Tampax tampons. So following the argument put forth in Liberwan's book that pollution is always linked to colonialism, we may consider the disposable products of menstrual management a form of colonialism too. Yes, colonialism of the beaches of Provincetown, but also, of course, of ways of life and cultural traditions surrounding menstruation that came before that might have been very different and even positive. Because as we'll see, these single-use items underpin a lot of stereotypical views of menstruation as something that should be kept secret and invisible. Next slide, please. So it was here on one of these sparkling beaches that Critchley first came across a plastic item in the sand, and then another one, and then within years, thousands upon thousands. And he could track an increase in these items coming onto the beaches. And that made him quite curious. You know, why was there an increase? What were these things? They changed shape and color a little bit during the late 70s, and he was confused about that too. So a lot of questions starting to emerge in the mind of this artist. Next slide, please. So not knowing what the items were at first, Critchley began collecting them. Locally, these items were known as beach whistles. So that might have been, you know, some people would have known what they were and used a euphemism to cover up for knowing. And some people, like Critchley, maybe in good faith, thought that they were beach whistles. There's quite an interesting example of how menstruation is often made secret through the use of selected language. Nevertheless, these beach whistles were a common phenomena on the beach. And as an artist with long-standing interest in activism, Critchley became even more interested when his sister told him what the object in fact was. Therefore, he became kind of initiated into this idea that the cylinders that he was collecting were controversial and taboo. And had it perhaps been someone who knew what these items were beforehand, we can only wonder if they had left them behind. It's certainly, in my experience, I've found similar cylinders and applicated tampon applicators on the beaches around St Andrews and in Fife, and I've not picked them up. I've just carried on walking. So I think that's quite a tiny example of whether or not you are comfortable with this topic or interested in it. It's either an object to overlook, to dismiss, to remain waste, or in this case, a very specific object of curiosity. So in this case, we can see that Critchley's lack of knowledge made him curious, and he started working it into his art practice. And you can see here his first outing as Miss Tampon Liberty, this performance art piece in which he made a garment made of the applicators that he had found. And they had, of course, been bleached and cleaned by the sea over several weeks, maybe even months. And this handmade garment he put on and transformed into this figure. And he performed this this work several times, as we'll come to see. So next slide, please. Now, Critchley, when he first was told about what the items were and began making artworks about it, Miss Tampon Liberty was one action point, but the overall project was soon given the acronym TACI, the Tampon Applicators Creative Clubs International. And together with other artists who I hope to do more research on in future months within the United States, but also in a wider international network, the TACI Club brought together people, and specifically artists, who were interested in the kind of creative potential of the applicators. But underpinning all of this was a criticism, an environmental criticism, as to the occurrence of these objects on beaches at all. So it's not like they were just having fun with it. They were trying to provoke a reaction from legislative bodies in the region. Soon thereafter, Critchley joined forces with environmental activists in the area and presented a bill to end the production of plastic non-biodegradable tampon applicators once and for all. And having interviewed the artist, it seems that that work began in the late 70s, and the presentation of the bill happened quite soon after. So this is an interesting, I think, historical occurrence for those of us following menstrual debates currently ongoing. There is so much talk about whether or not single-use plastics should be banned. And so to see that there is a precedent from the late 1970s is quite fascinating. So next slide, please. Now, TACI was this has come out quite small, but I can give you a bit of context. So TACI was a radical initiative to bring awareness to the problem. It had an art wing, and it had a kind of letter writing civil disobedience wing. And here you can see in this, it's a very tiny image here, but you can see that this letter is to the First Lady of the United States, Nancy Reagan at the time. And they are simply outlining the problem. The problem is that these items are littering the beaches. Is there anything she can do about it? And then they're mentioning this bill that is being written. And just about any famous woman or man in the United States, North America at the time, would have received a letter from TACI about this issue. And this happens late 1970s all the way through the 1980s. And Critchley has told me that he did, of course, never receive a single reply, with some exceptions that we'll look at later. Next, please. So it's at this stage perhaps worthwhile thinking about why these artists and activists were so provoked by what they were finding on the beach. What exactly were they finding? As I said, they had been stripped clean by sea salt and sand and retained their pinkish hues from the original colouring process of the hard plastic. These were items that were sold to be easily disposed and discreet. Yet they ended up in toilets, drainage systems, and oceans across the world because there weren't suitable disposal bins, for example, in all offices or public settings. So a lot of people, having used a tampon, didn't want to carry the applicator out of the cubicle, for example, with them. And so the only option was to flush. And it should be said too that for years, Tampax in particular was made with cardboard. And there was even for several decades information on the box that you should flush these items, that you could flush them. So in a sense, it's quite a lot to ask of a consumer who has been flushing for years to change their habits based on a simple technological alteration. And plastic tampon applicators were part of the larger plastic turn in consumer item manufacturing, begun in the late 1960s and certainly spearheaded within the United States as well. And the early history of this the early history of this industry has been well documented by historians like Shara Vostrel in her book Under Wraps, by Karen Hupert, whose book The Curse is all about the ways that taboos and these products intersect, and in Elizabeth Aveda Kisling's Capitalizing on the Curse, that makes an argument that these items made a consumer business out of the practice of menstruating itself. So these scholars have traced the changes that these tampons inflicted on consumers, but also the positive aspects of being able to quickly and discreetly use a tampon whenever necessary. Now, as I said before this, tampons were made mostly by cardboard and by the dominating US brand Tam Brands Incorporated. And Tam Brands Incorporated still owns Tampax for a large span of the history that Critchley is looking at these items for, and it's later sold to Procter & Gamble, and it's still one of the world's most popular brands today. So it's not to say that this is completely historical. Tampax is a brand that many of us will be aware of. Can I have the next slide, please? And I hope you saw in the last slide that Tampax itself uses lots of pictures of beaches and shorelines and swimming to underpin that one of the benefits of this technology, of course, is that you can be out in a bikini, in a swimming suit, without anyone knowing that you're menstruating. But it's a real contrast to when the applicator itself washes up on the shore. So I kind of like to imagine that these ladies on the right who are having a great day out on the beach might have come across some of the applicated tampons in a bit of a clash between reality and advertising here. Next, please. So, as I said, these cardboard items from earlier decades, and you can see that here, also often ended up in the ocean, but would dissolve into smaller pieces much faster and not leave visible traces on beaches. So cardboard was unreliable also to acquire, and the level of hardness could vary greatly across brands. Meanwhile, plastic could be streamlined and quality controlled more easily, creating an identical product across the world. Tampax itself was a global product from as early as the 1940s. So for consumers, it was argued by the manufacturer that insertion could be more comfortable with plastic because cardboard quickly turns soggy in contact with blood, whereas plastic was non-absorptive and remained smooth for insertion and removal. Now, visually, the cardboard system was much more suited, I'd argue, to the prevalent menstrual taboos of 20th century North America and beyond, in which most menstruators were committed to keeping bloodstains more or less invisible, aided by commercial products. In contrast, the turn to plastic applicators did not uphold the menstrual secrecy system in the same way, and plastic items stay intact, as we know, after use and wash up on the shores like those of Critchley. So it's likely that menstrual stigma contributed to the relatively lax environmental attitudes to these items, as even people who knew what they were turned away. And have found some documentation that the beach cleanups, both in Provincetown but also in Britain, has turned its eyes away from these items, perhaps because there's a sense of taboo regarding touching these, even though they've been in the sea for a long time. So this is complex. It's not black and white to say that cardboard was good and plastic was bad, but in terms of a technological and environmental history, it's an important change, this material turn from cardboard to plastic. Next, please. So by the late 1970s, Critchley could easily monitor the popularity of plastic applicators by the numbers of items increasing on local beaches year by year. And as he became more intrigued, he connected with other activists and artists. And as I said, this is part of what I want to do with this larger project, is to find out who were these other artists, how did they connect, how did they communicate, and what did they achieve. But we do know that around the world, many people were making similar discoveries to Critchley in their local environments. And artists also noted the creative potential of the iconic forms of tampons and pads. So like other artists, Critchley read the influential 1976 book, The Curse, A Cultural History of Menstruation. And in that book, the authors discuss information about the intersected economic, cultural, and medical aspects of the cycle. And they touch also on environmental impacts. And here we're talking about a wide definition of environmental, including things like toxics and scent and perfume used within the products, and the effect on the external world. So it's both environmental within the body and outside of the body. Now, his research led him to question the corporate responsibility of companies like Tam Brands, and increasingly concerns about plastic items were also being raised by the emerging feminist environmentalist movement in the 1970s, in which Critchley increasingly started to move. So he was therefore able to read about the intertwined issues of cotton bleaching, dioxins, toxic shock syndrome, which emerges a little bit later, and package waste. And this is documented by activists who later wrote the books that I'm showing you here. So you can see they're dated to the 90s, but they're all based on essays and presentation given in the 70s to the 80s. And really, these are some of the pioneering voices within this environmenstrual movement. So the sanitary protection scandal and whitewash are critical takedowns of the industry within both the UK and North America, and with a sense of global impact as well. And the book to the right is I have a lot of questions about this book. There's 101 super uses for tampons, and it encourages people to reuse their tampon applicators in fun and creative ways. And there's some images left over by the work of Laurie Katz and Barbara Mayer, but beyond this, I don't really know about their bigger project. But it was an artistic project to provoke people to think about reuse of the applicator itself, which is both kind of fun and creative. So I hope to find out more about this. So understanding this industry helped focus Critchley's attention. There was only a handful of tampon producers large enough to inflict so much plastic on the oceans and beaches around Provincetown. So knowing who created the products and what they were used for helped him sharpen his ideas for that he was operating through TACI, as we've discussed. With Miss Tampon Liberty soon taking on the role as the mission's global ambassador. So next slide, please. So provocative and controversial, always, Critchley and TACI's work tried different tactics. And although Miss Tampon Liberty has become the kind of symbol of this movement, I just wanted to show you one of the art pieces that didn't quite become as famous. And I think it's because it's really viscerally uncomfortable to look at least I find it this way. And this image, which is made of tampon applicators baked into a cake, which I think is made of oil, some sort of oil product in food coloring. It looks really visceral. There's a sense that it might be a placenta, there might be blood involved. And so here you have the artist really moving quite closely to the realities of menstruation. But these are the kind of images and works that didn't really get him and the movement very far, because there was a sense that you had to be a little bit careful. You could talk about menstruation if it was about environmentalism, for example, and through the image of the clean tampon washed by the sea. But images like this were provocative to a lot of viewers that he shared them with. Nevertheless, it shows us a really bold engagement with menstruation itself, and an unusual and quite brave strategy in the face of a very conservative art world. So next, please. So in contrast, we'll focus now on Miss Tampon Liberty. Now, Critchley has performed as Miss Tampon Liberty only 4 times. First, he had to make the costume, sewing together 3,000 plastic applicators by hand, all from the beach near him, and then wrapped around his body like a cape, echoing the Statue of Liberty, with pink and coral colors blended into a tapestry that moved every time that Critchley moved. Each plastic item bounced against its neighbor, creating an arresting, rattling sound as Critchley moves. So what's so interesting about this performance is that you hear it before you see it. And it has the effect that when he moves through a room, you have to turn around and think, what is that sound? So it's the sound of thousands of applicators smashing against each other. And I thought it was quite a beautiful sound when he demonstrated for me over Skype. In his hand, Miss Tampon Liberty sometimes carries a torch made of applicators, sometimes other ritualistic headpieces. Sometimes she sings and dances, sometimes she's silent, and the performances are designed to invoke both sacred rituals from across the world and a sound that can create a trance-like atmosphere for listeners. So it's not especially provocative in or unpleasant to view this. It's full of beautiful sounds and chanting and singing. And this in contrast perhaps to the reputation of tampons, and he's elevating them in a sense into the realm of art, but perhaps also into the realm of some sort of spiritual moment. So next, please. So Miss Tampon Liberty is loud and visible, but she's certainly not in charge. The title Miss was chosen by Critchley as a contrast to the increasingly popular Ms. of the 1970s, suggesting that this figure is defined by strict gender roles, as well as beauty contest and aesthetic discipline. So transgressing these boundaries as a cis man, Critchley's gender-bending performance was shocking to the onlookers who understand what the items covering his body symbolized, but he also had a great deal of feedback about how inappropriate it was that he should dress within this feminine garment. And so there's a sense of people protesting or taking in the artwork negatively, not only because of associations to menstruation, but because they do not like the idea that a man is involved in a feminized performance or in a topic that they deem only valuable for women, for example. Next, please. Now, one of the few instances that he was able to photograph of interactions with the public was his interaction with a police officer at the Boston State Capitol. And he was there in order to testify for this bill that he and others had put forward to end the production of all of these plastic applicators. But more often than not, the encounters were a little bit more, if not violent, aggressive than this. There was a lot of homophobic slurs towards Critchley. Others asked questions and, playfully pulled at the tampons and made fun of him. But he also noted that there were several people who came up to him and thanked him for his work and thought it was either really funny or really interesting to consider menstruation in this way. And most people, as he said, simply walked past him and just thought he was another artist trying to get attention. But it's quite an interesting image, this between the police officer and the artist. And Critchley in this moment is trying very seriously to get the police officer to let him into the building to carry on with his testimony, which was interrupted because he couldn't carry it out dressed as he was. Now, all the while, Critchley and others sought to spread awareness of the plastic applicator issue, keeping an eye on legislative change. Now, his next two performances as Miss Tampon Liberty were conducted only in legislative settings. The first was at the Massachusetts state legislature to petition the state to ban plastic applicators, which they did not, and then protesting outside the new Boston sewage outfall pipe, where applicators first entered the local water ecosystem. So you can see how precise this is. This group collectively found out where they needed to go, what actions and what infrastructure needed to be actioned. Now, his site-specific performances and installations as Miss Tampon Liberty during the 70s, 80s, and 90s were captured in photographs, one of which shows the artist dressed in a costume in front of the Statue of Liberty that we saw at the top, saluting the larger artwork in a similar pose. People surrounding him there are grinning, staring, or photographing the unusual scene, but the artist is very serious. And all through all of this, Critchley and his collaborators' consciousness about environmental impact on the world and on the beaches was growing. And the legislative side of this work intensifies as time goes by. So it's not intended to be funny. This kind of performance is intended to gain people's attention and then funnel them into the legislative issue of supporting the bill that they put forward. Next, please. So you can see here the petition of local lawmakers to stop the distribution or sale of certain feminine hygiene tampon-type devices composed in whole or in part of plastic or other non-biodegradable material. So this is 10th of March 1986. And, you know, as most bills and acts, they have several iterations back and forth. But this is when things start to solidify. In the end, nothing is made of any of this. It's not voted on. It's thrown out. It's a little bit unclear to me why. But I think it's a very interesting moment in time. This issue of language comes up yet again, feminine hygiene, maybe a little bit old-fashioned for us today. And then this tampon-type device, a sense of whoever wrote this didn't quite understand what the applicator perhaps was, because there was, of course, never any suggestion that tampons should be banned, but rather the applicators around them. So this is the moment in time where they got closest to affecting the local legislature, but it's thrown out almost immediately. So next, please. Oh, apologize again, these are quite small, but I'll take you through what's on here. While Critchley performed his pieces, the accumulative pressure from activists and consumers regarding environmental damage of plastic applicators forced key companies to respond, and I've got two examples here. In the early 1990s, Tambrands, so makers of Tampax, created the Tampax Environmental Woman of Action program, a competition to, quote, recognize US women who, through their creativity and determination, have initiated environmental action in their communities. And I think we can say that this is in direct response to the activists. In August 1992, Critchley received a letter informing him that he was nominated for the prize and that he might become the Woman of Action of the Year. He had been nominated by colleague Liz Armstrong, of the Women's Environmental Network, and who wrote one of the books that we looked at earlier, Whitewash. And she nominated him because she wanted them to recognize his fantastic work. But Tambrands had not understood that Armstrong had nominated a man and addressed the letter to Ms. J. Critchley, putting in an E at the end of his name and changing his pronouns at the start. Perhaps the letter from Tampax was the poetic conclusion of Miss Tampon Liberty's work, fleshing out the character with a first name and the more modern title of Ms. At any rate, J, with an E, was informed that she could win a 1,000 donation to a school of her choice to further environmental education and debate, and a trip to New York on an airplane for an awards ceremony. I love that. It's a bit of a carrot and a stick in terms of an award. But as a recognition for being nominated, J, with an E, received also a free box of Tampax applicator tampons. J, the artist, was left in stunned silence with this, with another box of beach whistles, the last thing he wanted in the world. And I think, needless to say, he tried to explain who he was, and that he wasn't J with an E. And needless to say, perhaps he did not win this competition. The other example that I'm showing you here was published in the Naturist Society. So again, a very specific outlet here for people interested in nature in all sorts of ways. And this is a Playtex ad. So Playtex was the great competitor of Tampax in North America at the time. And they are publishing here a word on the environment from Playtex, trying to make the case that their products are better than the competitor Tampax. They're using a slightly different plastic. They're still carrying on with their cardboard version. So you see here a first engagement with the corporations on this question, perhaps a good example that there's been some success. Next, please. So the history of menstrual waste management continues to evolve, and the Women's Environmental Network still organises an Environmenstrual Week of Awareness every year, and governments across the world have recently started collecting data about the issues and suggested solutions that might be possible. But this is, decades after this first legislative push. Next, please. So while Critchley did not succeed legislatively, his artworks document a history of protest through creativity and solidarity nonetheless. And I think it's a timely story that predates the current interest and anxiety in menstrual environmentalism by decades, linking the contemporary movement to a history of collective action against marine debris, consumer boycott, and protest against corporations. Breaking down the boundaries between genders, menstruators and non-menstruators, environmentalists and policymakers, creative artists and the public, the story of Miss Tampon Liberty is one that challenges corporate and political amnesia regarding pollution on this issue. And it's still very relevant work. We remember what happened when they banned single-use plastic tampon applicators in Mexico overnight, and the confusion for consumers who needed these products. We also remember activists like Ella Desch, who is still very much active and who has identified a great deal of plastic applicators on British, specifically Welsh beaches. And we know that also in Scotland, the Scottish government has a great interest in this problem, which it has mapped out in various research groups. So if we can just have the next slide, please. And to say too that Critchley is still very much alive and carries on working on this issue. And when I asked him what his takeaway is today, he said that what he thinks would be effective is that we stop calling them plastic applicators and start calling them petroleum applicators, which I think is quite a creative and quite funny solution. So final slide, please, and then I'll end. By exploring the menstrual product industry in his art for the last 40 years, Miss Tampon Liberty and Critchley have reconfigured the maligned object of menstrual waste several times. From his discovery of innocent beach whistles in the 1970s to the realization about their practical use as plastic tampon applicators, then into art and into a more precise definition of plastics as petroleum items. While he finds less applicators on the shoreline these days, because the Boston sewage outfall pipe finally installed a filter in the late 1990s that stopped so many products entering the sea, the odd applicator still turns up on Provincetown's beaches and indeed all around Fife. And you know, if you document this, I would love to know more about where you found it and your thoughts about it. So I'll just end there, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla. I really, really enjoyed that talk, and I always love hearing about your research in general, but the images that you showed were brilliant, and I think they really helped to illustrate what you were talking about. So I'm sure we'll have questions, but I'll just jump in if that's okay, with a comment and then a question. The first image that we saw on your cover slide of the Tampon Liberty outfit struck me because it reminded me of an indigenous Andean ukuku dancer from Bolivia or Peru. Their costume. That's the first thing I kind of thought of when I saw that image. And I initially wondered if that was coincidental, but you touched on that. That was going to be a question. Now it's just a comment. I mean, I don't know if you've got anything to add, but you touched on that in your talk, and it sounds like it was intentional.
Yes, yeah, just to answer quickly, this is one of the things I want to know more about, but of course it's quite complex in terms of the artist's identity and how he might identify. So it's a thing I really want to learn more about. Why the invocation of sacred ritual is included. Does it have a personal significance? I'm not quite sure. It certainly has a significance in terms of the land and the area he's operating in terms of Native American indigenous histories. And there's a question here too about appropriation potentially, but I don't know enough details to be able to say anything about this yet, but it's a really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Well, the question that I had might be related, might not. Yeah, I also wondered about the role of the history of witchcraft and the witch trials in Massachusetts, and if that might have played a role in Critchley's art, or the feminist discourses that you talked about that are linked to this art movement. And I guess with what was called witchcraft, you have sort of ideas about the land and special sites in the land and that kind of thing. So yeah, perhaps linked to what I was talking about before. That's
really, really interesting. I don't know. I'd love to ask him more about that. But I think there is a link between the re-examination of that that part of American history with the feminist movement that appears in the 1970s, and a re-examination of all the taboos to do with being a woman or being a feminized person. There is something about that cake that I showed, that kind of tampon cake. And there is I mean, I'm just speculating now, but there is a kind of tradition of like witch cakes and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if that is maybe part of what he's trying to reference there, folklore and stereotypes about the use of menstrual blood in spells, for example. So maybe there's something rich there that could be investigated. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Camilla. Are there any other comments or questions? I can't see any hands up. Oh, here we go. Bettina.
Hi, Bettina.
Hi, sorry, there we are. Right, I got a ton of questions. So obviously we talk a lot in the Menstruation Research Network, and one of the things that bothers me about this focus on feminine hygiene products, as they're still officially called, on beaches, is that it kind of perpetuates menstrual stigma. I always feel like the feminist killjoy there, right? They trade on the disgust that is provoked by anything to do with menstruation to say, look, this is an environmental pollution issue. And that kind of perpetuates this notion that menstruation is polluting, despite the people's best intentions. And we've seen this in our recent work in Scotland. That's precisely what's going on. And kind of, the activists, of course, are trying their hardest to get away from this, but it kind of, stigma is so pernicious, it keeps going. But one of the things that I was wondering about when you were speaking was whether the beauty of these products is actually a way of overcoming this a little bit more. I'm not surprised that they didn't keep carrying on with that placenta type cake, but then they use this costume, which looks good. And the last image that you showed from Ella Dage as well, the applicants, they're aesthetically pleasing objects, right? They're like, they're attractive, they're phallic, they're kind of, like permanent or at least long lasting. And some of the observations that we've made with respect to the menstrual cup are similar, that they're actually objects that you can be proud of and that have social capital attached to them because they are environmentally friendly and because they, they look good, right? They have a positive value. So I wonder if that's something that they consciously did, or whether it kind of just happened, and whether that is a way to get away from this notion of menstruation equals pollution.
Yeah, I think, thank you. That's really well observed. And I think what's maybe a little bit different here to other, because this is a conversation that we recognize today and that has happened again and again, in the 90s and the 2000s, 2010s, and again, this issue of plastic and menstrual products. But what's a little bit different here is the centering of art. And I feel that there's like a division here. They're elevating the products, as you say, into beauty, but certainly into art, which is a form of, the highest form of, human appreciation, we could say, right? So the products that are such intimate knowledge to so many people, you see them afresh, you see them in a new way, and there might be value to that. You might want to look at them for the first time in your life, perhaps. And then the anger on the activist side is focused only on legislation. So I think it's really interesting when they speak to the public, when they're out there, when he's performing, he's doing that with that dress, right? But when he got people to talk to him, he focused their attention on the legislative work. It's not about what can you do, you should change your consumer habits. To my knowledge, they never said that. It was never about the individual. It was about the corporation, it was about legislation, and it was about the sewage system. So really, really precise. And these people are only operating within Boston and, Massachusetts, Provincetown. So one question for me is, are there similar groups, in every state? Probably, what's starting to come to light that so many places in the world had similar debates at various stages. But it's very... well, it's interesting because I almost said it's very effective and nice the way that they're doing that, offering, beauty and art to the public, but then keeping that anger and frustration with legislation. But it's not effective because it didn't work, or maybe we need to think about what we consider effective. But in the end, it got thrown out and this debate kind of collapsed. And so I think we also need to look at what's worked. And the Mexico City thing is really interesting. I don't know so much about it, but there was a sense that legislation or council acted really, really quickly overnight, maybe not corresponding with the public as much as they should have done. So maybe sometimes what works, if what you want is to stop plastic altogether, is to not correspond with the public. I'm not quite sure. But I really like your point about that. It's generous towards the individual, this kind of project, and keeps the anger focused, for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something to do with neoliberalism and the pressure that was kind of this place on the individual to change rather than systems and all that kind of thing. But we've got a question from Rowan. I can't see the full name. I think it's Rowan.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I really loved that. That was so engaging and really fascinating. I feel like I've learned a lot. I've been working just for the past few months with a group, essentially delivering like workshops and stuff for mostly college students about sustainability, reusable period products, menstrual health, and stigma and that sort of thing. So we tried to cover quite a lot in like sort of 4-hour sessions. But one of the things that we've been kind of promoting quite a lot is like reusable like period underwear and reusable pads and things. Do you have like any kind of insight into like your thoughts on that, or when you were interviewing Jay, did he have any kind of info about that? Because I don't know how long that product has kind of been around, and then obviously it is more like, you know, it's more business, it's more like money making and selling you things. But like for me, I think it's a great product and I really love them, but I just wondered what you thought about them.
Yeah, it sounds like, you know, you're doing really great work and you're certainly part of this longer historical tradition, which is really exciting to see, you know, how even though it started long ago, it's still, you know, active in a way, which is fantastic. And yeah, no, I didn't ask Jay what he thought about, you know, contemporary menstrual products, but I think, you know, as you were saying, Sarah, there is a sense that that group was also very critical of all sorts of kind of, you know, attempts to make menstruation and the body a capitalist, you know, project. And so I would assume that a lot of his thinking about economics and choice and power would be the same even for these products. But for that specific project, the goal was to end single-use plastic. So I guess if there is a sense that this this type of management option that you're suggesting could do that, that would be good in terms of that goal, right? But if the goal is to free menstruation from, you know, all forms of capitalism, then obviously it's a little bit more complex. But I guess it could be good for some people and not for others. And I think in terms of looking at history, the sense that there's a bit more choice now in products, in the size of products, in the price of products, and the colors and shapes and fashion of the products, you know, within the system we live, that is often considered a good thing, right? The more choice, the better. But I've also seen criticism, and this comes from both Chris Boble and Brianne Fass in their work, that a lot of these new management systems, they still underpin the invisibility and, you know, the corporate control on all of this. So there's both new things and old things about them, I think. But it depends on what you want to solve. And it sounds like, you know, you're educating about environmental issues, and so they can solve parts of that, I guess, as long as you do the research and check, you know, does it actually measure up?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like listening to you today as well has given me like a new perspective on it that I was maybe missing as well. So just, yeah, thanks again for that. It was really good.
Oh, thank you.
And if there aren't any other comments or questions at the moment, I might just ask another one off the back of that one, and it might be beyond the scope of this project, Camilla, but I was thinking about microplastics, you know, when you were talking about the way that these items have been bleached and sort of almost reverted back to their original colour. I guess a lot of advances have been made since the 70s and 80s in understanding the ways that plastic kind of breaks down and how that impacts the sea life and humans and the food chain and all of that. Since Critchley was kind of actively working on this at the start, and I just wondered if you had anything to say about that. Again, it might be beyond the scope of this project.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's probably more of a consumer question, right? Rather than, I don't feel I can answer it because, you know, the corporations who still produce plastic applicators, they do provide some answers to that. They do say that the plastic has improved and that there's not so much waste, and they don't utilize the same type of dyes I'm aware of as they did. There's a sense of a movement away from scent, and some products are now bleach free. But, you know, that's what they put out into the world, and we're not privy as researchers to their research. So it's very difficult for me to understand whether the products actually have changed. I think you can see some changes if you were to, you know, look at an old tampon applicator versus a brand new ones. They do look and feel differently. But in terms of the details, the corporations don't share that. So I just don't know. And I think this is the question, because there's a lot of greenwashing in this industry too, of course. Yeah, it's a great question.
Lots of silence, like you were saying. Bettina has got another question.
Do we have time?
I think we've got time for one more, yeah.
Okay, grand. So there is research on that now, on the superabsorbent polymers that are in the tampons and in the pads themselves by someone called Van Eyck that I think came out last year. And that, you know, it's more than there's very few natural fibers. It's mostly plastics that tampons consist of, disposable tampons consist of. But what I wanted to ask was, coming back to that gown, the Miss Liberty image, because my view on menstruation and what we found in looking at these products washing up on Scottish beaches is that quite often the issue is containment and leakage. These are the terms that are used. So people want to contain the blood inside their body, keep it invisible, keep these applicators that are particularly visible, but also the pads out of sight, right? As you were saying, the concealment imperative, right? But by making them into a garment, that emphasizes the surface of the body, that then becomes, moving and making noises and kind of a bit more flexible and more open. And to do with this idea of liberty that we're often sold as that which tampons give us, right? We can then move freely and wear the white swimsuit and all that. And that as well, again, is a term that keeps recurring in contemporary Scotland with these free period products, the notion of free access, freedom, universal access to the public sphere, right? And I guess the Statue of Liberty has that ideal as well, like access to the public sphere for everyone. So to kind of play with that and kind of question what kind of liberty are we actually getting here, I think is genius.
Yeah, and I think too, it's, a Statue of Liberty for whom, right? Like that, there's a whole, again, we get back to Indigenous populations and immigration, right? Which he is incredibly interested in and does a lot of work with otherwise. And again, the choice to be Miss and not Ms, right? So there's a sense of, it's an intersectional critique in that he's obviously aware of the kind of pink washing and the feminist rhetoric that often comes up in these kind of advertising, and is making fun of that. But he's also invoking a specific US tradition of liberty, of freedom through commercial products and through shopping, right? And undercutting that by saying, well, this is what it looks like, and you don't like that either, right? These things that you have fought to have the freedom to buy, right? And yet you just, you make systems in which you have to dispose of them in the sea. It's not that you want to, but yeah, that's really good. I definitely want to think more about the liberty aspect. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's 2:00, so we'll wrap up there. I can't wait to read your book, Camilla, and thanks again for this talk. It's brilliant.
Thank you so much. It's really great questions, and thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Bye.